In early 1945, a 38-year-old general stood in his headquarters on Guam, staring at reconnaissance photos of Japanese cities. Curtis LeMay had been sent to the Pacific to fix a failing bombing campaign. For months, American B-29 bombers had attacked Japan from high altitude with minimal results. The strategy followed established Air Force doctrine, daylight precision bombing of military and industrial targets. It wasn't working. Japan's war production continued. The strategic bombing campaign was an expensive failure. LeMay's superiors wanted results. He had a solution, but it violated every principle of American air warfare. He would strip the bombers of their defensive guns, fly them at night at low altitude, and burn Japanese cities to the ground with incendiary bombs. His staff thought he was insane. His plan would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians and risk losing the entire bomber force. But LeMay believed it was the only way to end the war without invading Japan, which would cost 1 million American lives. On March 9, 1945, he ordered the first raid. By morning, Tokyo was in ashes, and 100,000 people were dead. It was the single deadliest air raid in history, more lethal than either atomic bomb. The strategy was horrifying, effective, and utterly contrary to everything the Air Force believed about strategic bombing. Curtis Emerson LeMay was born in 1906 in Columbus, Ohio, the son of an iron worker who drifted between jobs. The family was poor, moving frequently, and LeMay learned early that life was hard and survival required toughness. He worked odd jobs from childhood, delivered newspapers, and helped support his family. At Ohio State University, he studied engineering but couldn't afford to finish, leaving in 1928 to join the Army Air Corps as a flying cadet. Aviation offered escape from poverty and a path to something better. LeMay proved a natural pilot, cold, analytical, and unshakably calm under pressure. He had no interest in glamour or heroics. Flying was a job, and he was determined to be excellent at it. Through the 1930s, LeMay served in various bomber units, developing expertise in navigation and long-range flight. He was fascinated by the technical challenges of getting aircraft to targets hundreds of miles away and delivering bombs accurately. Most pilots saw bombing as straightforward: fly to the target, drop bombs, go home. LeMay saw it as a complex problem involving navigation, weather, formation flying, and precise timing. He became obsessed with improving bombing accuracy, conducting experiments, and developing techniques that became standard practice. By 1940, he was recognized as one of the Air Corps' best navigators and tacticians, though he remained a captain, junior in rank but senior in expertise. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, LeMay was assigned to the 8th Air Force in England, commanding bomber groups attacking occupied Europe. American doctrine held that heavy bombers flying in tight formation at high altitude could defend themselves with massed machine gun fire and bomb with precision in daylight. The British, who had tried daylight bombing and suffered catastrophic losses, urged the Americans to bomb at night instead. American commanders refused. They believed British bombers lacked adequate defensive armament and that American B-17s, bristling with guns, could fight their way through enemy defenses. LeMay was skeptical but followed orders. The early raids proved disastrous. German fighters tore apart bomber formations. Losses were staggering. Entire bomb groups were decimated. LeMay, now a colonel commanding the 305th Bomb Group, analyzed the failures coldly. The problem wasn't courage or equipment, it was tactics. Bomber formations were too loose, allowing fighters to isolate individual aircraft. Bombing runs were evasive, with pilots taking evasive action that scattered bombs everywhere except the target. LeMay instituted brutal discipline. He forced his pilots to fly straight and level on bombing runs, no matter how heavy the flak, to ensure bombs hit the target. He tightened formations so that defensive firepower overlapped. His group's losses decreased, while bombing accuracy improved dramatically. LeMay's methods were controversial. Pilots hated him. Flying straight through flak fields felt like suicide. But the numbers didn't lie. His group suffered fewer casualties and hit more targets than others. His success earned him rapid promotion. By 1944, at age 37, he was a major general commanding entire bomber divisions. He had become the Air Force's expert on strategic bombing, the man who made doctrine work through ruthless analysis and willingness to demand sacrifices. His reputation was as a cold, cigar-chomping martinet who cared more about mission success than individual lives. It wasn't entirely unfair. LeMay believed that wars were won by destroying the enemy's ability to fight, and squeamishness about methods only prolonged the killing. In 1944, LeMay was transferred to the Pacific to command Vietnamese Bomber Command, the B-29 Superfortress force attacking Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands. The B-29 was the most advanced bomber in the world, capable of flying higher and farther than any other aircraft. American planners believed it would devastate Japan through high-altitude precision bombing, the same strategy used against Germany, but the campaign was failing miserably. Japan's high-altitude winds, the jet stream, scattered bombs wildly. Cloud cover obscured targets. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, though less intense than over Germany, still inflicted losses. Most crucially, the raids weren't significantly damaging Japan's war economy. Factories continued producing weapons. The strategic bombing campaign was accomplishing little at enormous cost. LeMay arrived in January 1945 and immediately recognized the problems. High-altitude bombing required clear weather and precise navigation, neither reliably available over Japan. The jet stream winds at bombing altitude, sometimes exceeding 200 mph, made accurate bombing impossible. Ground speed varied so wildly that bombardiers couldn't calculate proper bomb release points. Additionally, Japanese industry was dispersed. Unlike Germany's concentrated factories, Japanese production was scattered across thousands of small workshops in residential areas. Precision bombing couldn't destroy targets you couldn't see or even accurately locate. The entire strategic approach was wrong for the Japanese target set. LeMay began considering alternatives. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese cities were highly vulnerable to fire. Most structures were wood and paper, densely packed in urban areas with minimal firefighting capability. Incendiary bombs could create firestorms that would consume entire districts. The British had used area incendiary bombing against German cities with devastating effect. Dresden, Hamburg, and other German cities had been burned out. American doctrine officially rejected area bombing of cities as contrary to American values, but LeMay didn't care about doctrine. He cared about ending the war. If burning cities would force Japan to surrender, then cities would burn. The plan he developed was radical and risky. B-29s would attack at night from low altitude, 5,000 to 8,000 feet instead of the usual 25,000 feet. Flying low would avoid the jet stream, improve bombing accuracy, and reduce fuel consumption, allowing greater bomb loads. Night attacks would reduce vulnerability to Japanese fighters, which lacked effective night fighting capability. Most controversially, LeMay ordered all defensive guns, except the tail position removed from the bombers. This saved weight, allowing even more bombs to be carried. His staff was horrified. Removing guns left bombers defenseless. Flying low put them within range of light anti-aircraft fire. The entire plan seemed suicidal. LeMay's calculations were coldly logical. Japanese night fighters were ineffective. Most anti-aircraft guns couldn't track fast-moving targets at low altitude and darkness. The real danger was mid-air collision in darkness over the target, not enemy action. By maximizing bomb load with incendiaries, each raid would deliver enough firepower to overwhelm Japanese firefighting capacity, creating firestorms that would consume entire cities. It was area bombing, deliberately targeting civilian areas to destroy war production and break morale. It was, by any definition, terror bombing. LeMay knew this. He accepted that history might judge him a war criminal, but he believed it would end the war faster than any alternative, saving American lives by making invasion unnecessary. On March 9, 1945, LeMay ordered the first low-level incendiary raid against Tokyo. Over 300 B-29s, stripped of most guns and loaded with incendiary bombs, flew through the night toward Japan's capital. Crews were terrified. Many wrote final letters before takeoff, convinced they were flying to their deaths. As the bombers approached Tokyo just after midnight, lead aircraft dropped incendiaries in an X pattern to mark the target area. Following bombers dumped thousands of incendiary clusters across the marked zone. Within minutes, fires merged into a conflagration. Winds generated by the heat created a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno that consumed everything combustible. The results were apocalyptic. Temperatures in the firestorm exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water in canals and melt metal. Winds sucked people into the flames. Firebombs ignited clothing, hair, and flesh. Shelters became ovens, suffocating occupants or cooking them alive. Firefighters were overwhelmed immediately. There was no fighting a firestorm, only fleeing. Over 16 square miles of Tokyo burned completely. Approximately 100,000 people died, most from burns and asphyxiation. Another million were left homeless. It was the single deadliest air raid in history, more lethal than the atomic bombings that would follow months later, and American losses were minimal. 14 bombers lost, mostly to accidents and mechanical failure. LeMay's plan had worked exactly as predicted. The strategic impact was immediate. Tokyo's industrial capacity was devastated. More importantly, the raid demonstrated that American bombers could burn Japanese cities at will with minimal losses. Over the following months, LeMay's command systematically firebombed every major Japanese city except Kyoto, which was spared for cultural reasons. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities were burned out. By summer 1945, Japan's urban areas were largely destroyed. Industrial production collapsed. Transportation networks failed. Food distribution broke down. Millions of civilians were homeless, injured, or dead. The firebombing campaign killed an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 Japanese civilians and left millions more homeless. LeMay never expressed public regret. In later interviews, he stated bluntly that if America had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He accepted that his tactics were brutal, but believed they were necessary. Japan had started the war with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and conducted the war with extreme brutality across Asia. American soldiers faced a fanatical enemy who fought to the death rather than surrender. Planning for the invasion of Japan estimated casualties of 500,000 to 1 million Americans and millions of Japanese military and civilian dead. The firebombing campaign, horrific as it was, killed fewer people than invasion would have. LeMay calculated that burning cities saved lives overall. Whether this justification holds depends on one's moral framework and whether ends can justify means. Military historians remain divided on LeMay's strategy. Some argue it was militarily effective but morally indefensible, equivalent to the atrocities America condemned in its enemies. Others contend that total war against a fanatical enemy required extreme measures and that LeMay's campaign achieved its objective of forcing surrender without invasion. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 received more historical attention, but LeMay's firebombing campaign killed more people and arguably did more damage to Japan's ability to continue fighting. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving excuse for surrender. The firebombing had already broken Japan's will to resist. After the war, LeMay continued rising through Air Force ranks. He organized the Berlin Airlift in 1948, supplying blockaded West Berlin entirely by air for nearly a year, a logistics triumph. In 1948, he became commander of Strategic Air Command, the nuclear bomber force tasked with deterring Soviet aggression. He transformed SAC from a disorganized collection of units into a ruthlessly efficient war machine, constantly ready to launch nuclear strikes. His motto was, "Peace is our profession," but his methods were anything but peaceful. He kept bombers on constant alert, demanded perfection, and fired commanders who failed to meet his standards. Under LeMay, SAC became the most powerful military force in history, capable of destroying Soviet cities within hours. LeMay's tenure at SAC cemented his reputation as a Cold Warrior, willing to use nuclear weapons. He advocated preemptive nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union, arguing that a surprise attack would cripple Soviet forces before they could retaliate. He believed deterrence required credible threats and that Americans were too squeamish about nuclear weapons. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, LeMay pushed President Kennedy to authorize airstrikes and invasion of Cuba, dismissing the risk of nuclear war. Kennedy rejected his advice, negotiating a peaceful resolution instead. LeMay was furious, believing Kennedy had shown weakness. The incident revealed the danger of military commanders untempered by political oversight. LeMay retired from the Air Force in 1965 as a four-star general and chief of staff. He had spent 21 years as a general officer, far longer than most, and shaped American air power doctrine for decades. His legacy was massive: strategic bombing campaigns in 2 wars, the Berlin Airlift, and the creation of modern nuclear deterrence through SAC. But his public image was complicated. To supporters, he was a tough, effective commander who did whatever necessary to win. To critics, he was a warmonger whose willingness to use extreme force bordered on madness. His 1968 vice presidential campaign alongside segregationist George Wallace cemented his reputation as a right-wing extremist. He lost badly, rejected by a public increasingly skeptical of military solutions. In retirement, LeMay remained unrepentant about his wartime actions. He wrote memoirs defending the firebombing campaign and arguing that strategic bombing had been essential to victory. When asked about the morality of burning cities full of civilians, he responded that war itself was immoral, and that trying to fight a moral war only prolonged the killing. His position was consistent. Military force should be applied with maximum effect to achieve victory as quickly as possible. Half measures prolonged wars and increased total suffering. This philosophy made him effective but also troubling, a man seemingly without moral constraints when he believed the cause was just. Modern strategic bombing doctrine reflects LeMay's influence while attempting to impose moral limits he would have found pointless. Precision-guided munitions allow targeting military objectives while minimizing civilian casualties, at least in theory. International law prohibits deliberate attacks on civilians. Yet the fundamental tension remains. In total war against a committed enemy, can military objectives be achieved without inflicting massive civilian casualties? LeMay answered yes, but only by accepting those casualties as necessary. Contemporary doctrine says no. Such casualties are unacceptable, but wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere suggest the tension is unresolved. Precision weapons reduce but don't eliminate civilian deaths. and insurgent enemies deliberately operate among civilians, creating the same dilemmas LeMay faced. The firebombing campaign against Japan remains controversial 75 years later. Was it a war crime, mass murder of civilians for strategic gain, or was it a necessary evil that shortened the war and saved lives overall? The answer depends partly on counterfactuals. What would have happened without the firebombing? If Japan had fought on, requiring invasion, casualties would have been catastrophic on both sides. Soviet entry into the war might have partitioned Japan like Germany, with unimaginable consequences. The atomic bombs might have been used more extensively. Against these hypotheticals, the firebombing's death toll seems almost merciful. But this logic is deeply uncomfortable, justifying mass killing through speculation about worse alternatives. LeMay's defenders note that he faced an enemy that had committed extensive atrocities across Asia. Japanese forces massacred millions of Chinese civilians, brutalized prisoners of war, and conducted biological warfare experiments. Japanese military culture emphasized death before surrender, making conventional defeat nearly impossible. Facing such an enemy, Western ethical norms seemed like a luxury America couldn't afford. LeMay made the hard choices, accepting moral burden to achieve necessary outcomes. His critics respond that this logic leads to total war without limits, where any atrocity can be justified by military necessity. If burning civilians is acceptable, what isn't? Where do moral limits exist in warfare? These questions have no easy answers, which is why LeMay's legacy remains contested. He was undeniably effective. His tactics achieved their objectives with minimal American losses. Whether those objectives justified the means remains disputed. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that LeMay was a product of total war, a conflict where normal moral constraints collapsed under existential stakes. In such wars, men like LeMay emerge, willing to do terrible things in service of victory. Whether they are heroes, criminals, or simply tragic figures who bear necessary burdens is perhaps unanswerable. Curtis LeMay died in 1990, at age 83, having outlived most of his wartime contemporaries. His obituaries were respectful but ambivalent, acknowledging his effectiveness while noting the controversial nature of his methods. He received full military honors, a recognition of his service and rank, but there were no calls to name major installations after him, no push for monuments. LeMay's memory made people uncomfortable. He had been too effective at killing, too willing to embrace terrible methods, too untroubled by moral qualms. America wanted heroes who won cleanly, not butchers who won efficiently. Yet LeMay's influence persists in American military culture. The doctrine of overwhelming force, applying maximum military power to achieve quick victory, echoes his philosophy. The Air Force's emphasis on strategic bombing and air superiority reflects his legacy. The concept of deterrence through credible threats of massive retaliation comes directly from his tenure at SAC. Modern officers study his campaigns as examples of innovative tactics and operational art. They may not admire him personally, but they learn from his methods. In this sense, LeMay won. His ideas outlived his reputation. The firebombing of Tokyo stands as one of history's deadliest single events, comparable to the atomic bombings and the worst massacres of the 20th century. It demonstrated that conventional weapons, properly employed, could achieve destruction previously requiring siege warfare or occupation. It proved that civilians in modern war were combatants by default, their deaths acceptable if they contributed to strategic objectives, and it established that air power alone could devastate enemy nations without ground invasion. These lessons shaped warfare for decades, justifying strategic bombing campaigns from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq. LeMay's raid on Tokyo was not just an attack, it was a template. The moral burden of that night in March 1945 rests on Curtis LeMay's shoulders. He ordered the raid, designed the tactics, and accepted responsibility for the outcome. 100,000 dead in a single night, killed by American bombs deliberately targeting a densely populated city. LeMay never shirked that responsibility. He owned it, defended it, and argued it was necessary. Whether that makes him a war criminal or a realistic strategist facing terrible choices depends on one's perspective. History hasn't reached consensus. Perhaps it never will. The general who burned cities to end a war, who stripped guns from bombers and sent them low over enemy territory, who calculated that killing hundreds of thousands of civilians would save millions of lives, who faced accusations of war crimes with cold certainty that his actions were justified. Curtis LeMay violated every principle of humane warfare his country claimed to uphold. His tactics were rejected as heretical, suicidal, and barbaric. Then they worked, devastatingly, undeniably, ending the war and bringing soldiers home. The Air Force called his plan insane until Tokyo burned. Then it became doctrine. The moral philosophers called him a monster. The soldiers whose lives he saved called him a savior. The dead of Tokyo, Osaka, and 50 other Japanese cities have no voice. Their ashes are LeMay's monument, a grim testament to the proposition that in total war, victory belongs to whoever is willing to go furthest. LeMay went further than anyone else dared. Japan surrendered, America won, and the world learned that modern war has no floor, no limit below which civilized nations will not descend when survival is at stake. Curtis LeMay proved that, one burning city at a time,